Summer night, 1972. Las Vegas glows like a furnace of neon, and inside the International Hotel, the air is thick with perfume, cigar smoke, and fevered anticipation. Businessmen in tailored suits rub shoulders with movie stars, while families from dusty small towns clutch their tickets as if they were golden keys. The orchestra swells, the crowd roars, and then, through the blinding spotlights, Elvis Presley strides onto the stage in his dazzling white jumpsuit, rhinestones catching every beam of light. The room shakes with applause, but fate has other plans. After one song ends and the echoes fade, a single voice cuts through the glittering chaos. High, cracked, trembling, the voice of a boy. "Mr. Presley, can I ask you something?" The crowd freezes. Laughter ripples, then silence. Security leans forward, ready to drag him out. But before they can, Elvis raises his hand. His gaze finds the child in the sea of faces. "Let him speak," he says. In that instant, the spectacle of Las Vegas transforms. What was supposed to be just another show becomes something raw, unscripted, unforgettable. A moment that would follow Elvis for the rest of his life. The music crashed into its final chord, and the hall thundered with applause. Elvis stepped back, gave a brief nod of thanks, and for a moment there was silence. A breath held in the lungs of thousands. The orchestra waited for his cue. The crowd, restless, leaned forward in expectation. That silence was the opening the boy had been waiting for. His chest was tight, and his palms were wet against the little notebook hidden in his jacket. He hadn't planned the exact moment, hadn't rehearsed it. He only knew that if he didn't speak now, the chance would vanish like smoke. The words burst out before he had time to second-guess himself. His small voice cracked, but the force behind it was sharp enough to cut through the cavernous hall. "Mr. Presley!" The cry was raw, torn straight from the middle of his chest. "What do you do when your daddy's gone, and you've got to stay strong for your mama?" The sound hung in the air, ragged, almost too honest for a place filled with glitter and showmanship. For a second, it seemed no one understood what they'd heard. Then the room fractured. A ripple of uneasy laughter ran through one corner of the audience, an instinctive reaction to a child's voice breaking the script. Somewhere else, a man barked, "Sit down, kid!" And another voice jeered, "Quiet back there!" Yet in the same breath, scattered applause began. A woman in a sequined dress pressed her hand over her heart and clapped once, twice, then again with rising intensity. Others joined, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the hall was a patchwork of anger, confusion, and sudden respect. The boy froze. Heat flooded his face. His knees nearly buckled. For a moment he wished he could vanish between the rows of chairs, dissolve into the velvet carpet. He could feel the eyes of hundreds of strangers drilling into him. His mouth was dry. His heart thudded so violently he wondered if it was audible. High above in the balcony, his mother rose halfway from her seat, trembling. She pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Tears pricked at the corners of her vision, not only from fear that her boy would be dragged out by force, but because she had just heard aloud the words he had been carrying for months, the ones she knew he wrote in that battered notebook by the dim light of their kitchen lamp. Down front, the security guards stiffened. One of them immediately began pushing through the crowd toward the boy. The second followed, his jaw set, ready to remove the disruption before the show unraveled. Their dark suits cut through the sea of sequins and tuxedos like blades. The audience caught on. Some cheered the guards forward, eager for the boy to be gone, to restore the spectacle they had paid for. Others hissed in protest, sensing something unusual unfolding, not just another heckle or childish outburst. And then Elvis moved. From the center of the stage, he raised one hand, palm out, firm but calm. His gaze was fixed on the boy. He didn't say a word at first, but his gesture froze the guards mid-step, as if they'd been caught in a spotlight themselves. The crowd hushed in confusion. Elvis tilted the microphone slightly away from his lips, leaned just enough toward the audience, and spoke with a measured drawl that carried to the farthest row. "Let the boy be." The hall erupted, not with noise, but with stillness. It was as though every sound had been vacuumed from the air. Even the orchestra members lowered their instruments, glancing at one another in disbelief. The percussionist held his sticks aloft, frozen. The brass players' mouths hovered near their mouthpieces, but did not move. The boy's lungs burned. He realized he had stopped breathing. Elvis had looked at him, really looked, as though the child in the cheap shirt mattered more than the flashing cameras or the champagne glasses clinking in the background. Slowly, with a gentle authority, Elvis gestured toward the stage. "Come on up here, son." Gasps rolled through the crowd. No one had expected this. Breaking the wall between performer and audience was one thing. Inviting a ragged boy from the cheap seats to step into the spotlight was another altogether. It wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of. The boy's legs felt like water. Each step toward the stage seemed impossibly heavy, yet carried by some invisible force he could not resist. He clutched the notebook inside his pocket as if it were a lifeline. The guards who had been moments away from dragging him out now stood aside, bewildered, caught between orders and the unmistakable command of the man they were hired to protect. He stumbled once, his shoe catching the carpet. A murmur swept through the crowd. His vision blurred from nerves, but the sight of Elvis waiting, calm, steady, hand extended just slightly, pulled him forward. From the balcony, his mother's sobs broke free, muffled by her hands, but audible enough that those seated nearby turned to look. She wasn't embarrassed anymore. She was terrified, but also overcome by something else. A fragile hope that this impossible moment might carry her son beyond the grief that had been suffocating him since the accident. By the time he reached the foot of the stage, the hall was silent again. No one dared speak. The boy looked up, blinking into the brilliance of the lights. Elvis extended his hand a fraction more, and the boy, trembling, reached upward. The world seemed to stop. Thousands of people leaned forward at once, watching a poor miner's son from Arkansas place his hand into the palm of the king of rock and roll. And in that stillness, thick, electric, alive, history quietly shifted. The boy's hand was swallowed in Elvis's grip, warm and steady, as the singer gently guided him up the few steps to the platform. The lights blinded at first, so strong they seemed to burn straight into the boy's eyes, but Elvis shielded him for a moment with his own body. To the audience, it looked almost ceremonial, the king offering his protection to a child pulled out of the shadows. Up close, Elvis was taller than the boy imagined, his presence even heavier than the rhinestones and the high collar suggested. The boy, in his plain shirt and worn shoes, looked like a sparrow beside a hawk. His lips trembled, and though he had screamed his question moments before, now not a sound would leave him. Elvis crouched slightly, lowering himself so their eyes met. The microphone hovered between them, still hot with the echoes of the last song. "What's your name, son?" His voice was gentle, with none of the sharpness of the stage persona. The boy swallowed. "Daniel," he whispered, almost lost in the silence of the hall. Elvis nodded once, as though memorizing it. He lifted the microphone closer. "Daniel here asked me something," he said. his drawl stretching the syllables so everyone in the hall caught each word. He asked, "What do you do when your daddy's gone, and you have to be strong for your mama?" The repetition landed like a blow. The hall erupted in a hushed murmur. People shifted in their seats, some gasping, some whispering, "Lord, have mercy." The boy's question was no longer his alone. It now belonged to everyone listening. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He hadn't meant to speak it so plainly, but now there was no taking it back. The sound of thousands of people breathing in the same silence pressed down on him, suffocating and enormous. He wanted to shrink, to vanish, yet Elvis's hand remained firm on his shoulder, anchoring him. For a long moment Elvis said nothing. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. The audience could see it, the flicker of vulnerability in the man they had come to watch as an icon, not a mourner, not a son. He lowered the microphone, glanced down, and seemed to wrestle with something private. Finally, he leaned closer to Daniel. "You know," he said quietly, but into the mic so the whole room heard, "I didn't grow up with much of a father either." His voice cracked only slightly, a hairline fracture that made the words all the more piercing. "My mama, she was everything. We didn't have much but each other. Sometimes you've got to stand tall before you're ready." The boy's throat ached. He tried to nod, but instead his eyes filled. He hated crying in front of strangers, yet he couldn't stop the tears streaking down his cheeks. Elvis didn't flinch. He pulled the boy into a loose embrace, his hand cupping the back of Daniel's head. The audience reacted not with screams this time, but with a rising sound that felt like wind swelling, throats clearing, sniffles, hands clapping not in frenzy, but in solidarity. Even the photographers who had been jostling for position lowered their cameras for a moment, caught off guard by the intimacy. Elvis straightened and lifted Daniel gently onto the edge of the stage so the boy could sit beside him. The move drew a collective gasp. This was no planned stunt. No manager had approved a child sitting shoulder to shoulder with the king. Elvis turned back to the microphone. His words came slowly, with weight. "People think strength means you don't cry. That's not true. Strength means you hold your mama's hand and you keep walking. You sing for her when she can't sing. You smile for her when she's tired. That's strength." The room fell utterly silent again. Some of the wealthiest men in Nevada, seated in the first rows, shifted uncomfortably, as if their expensive suits could shield them from the raw truth of it. Women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, mascara streaking their cheeks. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, still clutching the notebook inside his pocket. For the first time since his father's death, the words he carried didn't feel like a weight he bore alone. Elvis glanced down at him and managed a small grin. "You're tougher than you think, son," he said, "and don't you forget it." The boy nodded, his voice too choked to answer. But in that moment, he didn't need to. The hall itself spoke. The hush, the tears, the collective stillness of thousands who had come for music, but found themselves witnesses to something far more unguarded. And for the first time all evening, Elvis himself seemed lighter, as though he, too, had unburdened a piece of his own childhood by answering a question no stage show could have prepared him for. The words had barely left Elvis's lips when the hall seemed to lock itself into silence. The kind of silence that was not emptiness, but a weight, pressing down on every chest in the room. Thousands of people sat in sequined dresses and silk ties, their champagne glasses forgotten, their cigarettes burning out between trembling fingers. Then, as though some hidden signal passed through the crowd, the applause began. Not the wild, fevered shrieking, that usually greeted Elvis when he moved across a stage, but something slower, deeper. Hands clapped not in frenzy but in gratitude. The sound grew, warm and deliberate, until it rolled like thunder contained inside the velvet walls. Yet Elvis did not stand, did not bask in the applause. Instead, he lowered himself to the edge of the stage, his boots planted just inches from the orchestra pit, and sat there with the boy beside him. The sight alone was enough to send murmurs rippling through the audience. The king of rock and roll seated cross-legged on the stage like a neighbor leaning over a fence to talk. He let the clapping fade before he spoke again. His eyes, usually sharp with stage energy, softened, his voice dropping into a register most people had never heard outside his closest circle. "You all came here tonight to hear songs," he said slowly, drawing out the words so no one missed a syllable. "But I'll tell you something I don't tell often. When I was a boy, there were nights my mama cried herself to sleep. We didn't have enough to eat sometimes, didn't know how we'd make it to the next week. And I'd sit there listening, wishing I could do something, anything, to make her stop hurting." Gasps rippled through the room. This was not part of the act. Elvis Presley rarely spoke about his childhood publicly. His legend was built on triumph, not the raw truth of nights spent in poverty, the father in and out of prison, the mother's quiet suffering. The boy, Daniel, stared at him wide-eyed. For the first time, he didn't feel small. The king himself knew the weight of what he carried. Elvis continued, his gaze roaming over the crowd, not hiding the crack in his voice. "Folks see the rhinestones, the lights, the headlines. They think it's always been this way. But I remember when we lived in a house with holes in the roof, big enough to see the sky through. I remember walking to school in shoes that didn't fit." He paused, almost smiling, though it was a bitter kind of smile. "And I remember promising myself I'd give my mama more. That's all I ever wanted. To see her rest easy, just once." The audience shifted uneasily. Wealthy casino owners, celebrities, and out-of-town guests who had come for spectacle found themselves staring into a mirror they hadn't asked for. Women in fur stoles dabbed their eyes. Men in tuxedos looked down at their polished shoes as though ashamed of how much they had taken for granted. A woman in the front row, her diamonds flashing under the spotlights, whispered audibly to her companion, "I never knew. My God, I never knew." Elvis leaned closer to the microphone, but his body tilted toward Daniel, as though the confession were meant as much for the boy as for anyone else. "You see, son," he said softly, "it don't matter how high you climb. Some parts of your childhood never leave you. They shape you. They hurt. But they teach you how to stand tall." Daniel blinked hard, fighting fresh tears. For months he had carried his grief like a secret burden. Now, before thousands, Elvis had reached into the same darkness and named it out loud. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. Instead, they sat in stunned quiet, the weight of his words settling over them like dust after an explosion. The orchestra members, who had been waiting for the cue to strike the next note, exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They knew this was unscripted, unrepeatable. Finally, as if a dam broke, the hall erupted. Applause crashed down, louder this time, but not manic, reverent. People rose from their seats without thinking. Entire rows stood, clapping, crying, their faces lit by the strange glow of shared humanity. Daniel looked out at the crowd, dizzy. A few hours earlier, he had been nothing more than a miner's son in a second-hand shirt. Now he was sitting beside the most famous man alive, both of them wrapped in a moment of truth, that had cracked the glittering shell of Las Vegas wide open. Elvis glanced sideways at him and gave the boy a tiny nod, almost imperceptible but filled with meaning. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." And for the first time since his father's death, Daniel allowed himself to believe it. Behind the stage curtain, the managers were pacing like caged animals. This was not the show they had sold. The schedule was tight. Songs had been timed to the second, lighting cues rehearsed, photographers positioned to catch the famous scarf ritual. But now everything was unraveling in front of them, live, with thousands of witnesses. One of the senior stagehands, a man in a dark headset, leaned forward and hissed into his microphone, "Get the boy off! Now!" His words buzzed in the earpieces of security scattered around the room. Two guards at the foot of the stage tensed, waiting for the smallest signal to move in. Their faces were masks of professionalism, but their eyes betrayed unease. Who would dare touch a child when Elvis Presley himself had invited him onto the stage? The casino executives were furious. They had paid for control, for polished glamour, not for unscripted confessions that risked slowing down drink orders and bets. In their world, every minute of spectacle was tied to revenue. A manager waved his arms at the lighting booth, mouthing frantically, "Cut it! Cue the next song!" But the orchestra stayed silent, unwilling to interrupt the scene. The audience sensed the invisible tug of war. They could see the nervous figures darting behind the curtains, feel the tension in the way security shifted their weight from one foot to another. Something fragile and extraordinary was unfolding, and the crowd refused to let it be crushed by routine. Elvis saw it too. He ignored the frantic hand gestures from the wings. His jaw tightened, and for the first time that evening, he let defiance show in his face. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down and took the small, battered notebook that Daniel had been gripping against his chest. The boy's eyes widened in panic. That notebook was his most private possession, filled with shaky handwriting, crooked lines, questions he had been too afraid to say aloud. But Elvis gave him a reassuring glance, a tiny tilt of the head that seemed to say, "Trust me." He flipped the cover open, the pages curled and smudged from constant handling. Without ceremony, he began to read aloud. "I want to be a singer one day," Elvis read, his voice steady into the microphone. "Not for money, but so I can buy Mama a house where she doesn't cry at night. I want her to feel safe." The hall erupted. People gasped. Some clapped. Others pressed their hands over their mouths to contain sobs. The words were too simple, too unvarnished to be anything but true. They pierced straight through the glitter and smoke of Las Vegas. Elvis looked back at Daniel and let the notebook close softly in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is what's real. Not the rhinestones, not the cameras. This." He tapped the notebook gently. "The heart of a child who wants nothing more than to take care of his mama." The applause that followed shook the walls. Entire rows stood on their feet, stomping, clapping, cheering not like crazed fans, but like people desperate to affirm the truth they had just heard. The guards hesitated again, caught between the orders in their earpieces and the roar of the audience that had already decided which side of the battle they were on. Daniel sat frozen, his face hot with both pride and embarrassment. Never had he imagined his scribbled words would echo through a hall this size. Never had he thought his private longing, the one he whispered only to himself at night, would be laid bare in front of strangers. But in Elvis's hands, those words didn't feel childish. They felt powerful. Behind the curtain, the managers argued in frantic whispers. "He's off script," one hissed. "This isn't the act. Get them out of there." But no one moved. To interrupt now would be career suicide. Elvis handed the notebook back with care, as if returning something sacred. He kept his hand on Daniel's shoulder, his posture calm but unmovable, like a shield against the invisible forces pushing to end the moment. His voice cut through the chaos. Sometimes a child's dream is worth more than any ticket, more than any schedule. The audience answered with a standing ovation so loud the chandeliers trembled. The casino owners might have seen a disruption, but the people in the hall knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Daniel clutched the notebook tightly against his chest again. He could feel the pages still vibrating with the echo of Elvis's voice. The dream he had carried in silence was no longer invisible. It had been given breath, weight, and recognition before thousands. And in that instant, the balance of power in the room shifted. It was no longer the manager's show. It wasn't even the casino's spectacle. For the first time, the stage belonged entirely to Elvis and the boy. The applause still thundered when Elvis leaned forward and spoke softly to Daniel, his lips close enough that the boy alone could hear. "Stay with me." The boy nodded, gripping the notebook so hard his knuckles turned white. Then Elvis stood and turned back to the orchestra pit. He lifted his hand, palm outward, a silent command. The musicians froze, waiting for his cue. For a long beat, no one knew what he would do. The managers backstage whispered frantically into their headsets, demanding the program resume. But Elvis ignored them. His shoulders relaxed, his head tilted slightly back, as though he were searching his memory for the right melody. Finally, he called out a song title. Not one of the big showstoppers, not a track designed for the frenzy of Las Vegas, but a quiet tune from years earlier. A ballad that spoke of faith and perseverance. His voice wasn't a barked order, but a gentle request, yet the orchestra obeyed. Strings hummed softly, then the piano joined, sketching out the bare bones of the melody. Elvis took the microphone and lowered his tone. He didn't belt. He didn't strut. Instead, he sang as though the boy beside him was the only soul in the hall. Every phrase landed tender, restrained, weighted with sincerity. The audience, conditioned to hear him as a larger-than-life figure, now saw something else entirely. A man stripping away the stage persona until nothing remained but raw humanity. Daniel stared at him, unable to blink. He had memorized every record, hummed every chorus under his breath while working in the yard back home. But hearing Elvis sing like this, directly, personally, unguarded, was like discovering a secret language only he could understand. The audience barely breathed. The casino waiters stopped in the aisles, their trays balanced on fingertips, unwilling to move. Even the sound of glasses clinking had ceased. The ballad filled every corner of the room, but it did not swell. It hovered, delicate, as if one wrong sound could break it. At the final line, Elvis's voice thinned to a near whisper. He held the note until silence pressed in from every wall. Then he let it dissolve into nothing, lowering the microphone to his side. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. Then, as though on cue, the audience erupted. Shouts, sobs, applause that shook the rafters. But Elvis didn't stand tall and bask in it. Instead, he turned to Daniel. Around his neck hung the trademark silk scarf, damp with sweat under the hot lights. It was a ritual for him to toss such scarves into the crowd, where fans would claw at them like relics. Tonight, though, he removed it slowly, folded it once in his hands, and draped it gently over Daniel's shoulders. The boy's lips parted in shock. His throat worked as he tried to speak, but no words came. The scarf smelled faintly of cologne and the salt of exertion. To the crowd, it was a gesture they recognized. But the way Elvis did it, personal, deliberate, not theatrical, transformed it into something sacred. The hall exploded again, but this time it wasn't the manic scream of idol worship. It was reverence. Men who had never cried at music found themselves swallowing hard. Women clutched their pearls, not from frenzy, but from awe. Everyone in that room knew instinctively they were witnessing something that no program or contract could manufacture. Daniel leaned forward, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. He wrapped his small arms around Elvis's waist, burying his face against the rhinestones and sweat-damp fabric. Elvis held him close, one hand steady on the boy's back, unbothered by the cameras snapping furiously. Backstage, the managers finally stopped shouting. They could see it in the audience's reaction. There was no reclaiming the night. The schedule had shattered, and no one cared. When Elvis stepped back, he kept his hand on Daniel's shoulder and looked into the crowd. His expression was different now, not the polished grin of a performer, but the solemn look of a man aware he had just crossed an invisible line. He had turned the stage into something unrepeatable, a moment carved out of grief and hope that no casino contract could ever control. And the people knew it. They rose to their feet in a wave, clapping, crying, stamping, desperate to honor what they had just seen. It wasn't a show anymore. It was history. Daniel sat there, still stunned, the silk scarf heavy around his neck, the notebook pressed to his chest, as though the weight of both might keep him from floating away. He didn't know it yet, but in that instant, he had become part of the story that would be told and retold long after the chandeliers dimmed and the neon outside flickered out. The ovation rolled like thunder, but Elvis didn't raise his arms to claim it. Instead, he stayed turned toward the boy, one hand steady on his small shoulder. The lights poured down so bright, Daniel felt as though every pore on his face had been revealed to the world, yet the grip on his shoulder steadied him. Elvis leaned into the microphone, though his voice was pitched low, almost conversational. "Y'all can clap all night," he said with a soft smile, "but there's something else we need to hear." He turned to Daniel, giving him a moment to adjust to the silence that followed. The boy blinked, terrified. He hadn't expected more than that scarf, more than those words. But now Elvis was sliding the microphone into his hand, its heavy weight pulling his arm down. The crowd gasped audibly. Never had they seen the king hand his stage to someone else, let alone a poor 12-year-old. Elvis crouched beside him, speaking so the microphone picked up every word. "Son, you've got a dream. Don't keep it locked inside. Tell them what it is. Right here. Right now." Daniel's mouth was dry, his heart pounding against the scarf still warm on his chest. He swallowed hard. I just want to sing one day," he stammered. His voice cracked, fragile but piercing in the silence. "I want to sing so I can buy my mama a house, so she doesn't cry at night anymore." The hall held its breath. It was a confession too bare for such a glittering place. Some in the front rows pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. Others sat motionless, riveted by the purity of the statement. No ambition of fame, no talk of money or glory, just a boy's aching wish for his mother. Elvis nodded solemnly, then spoke again, not to the crowd, but to the boy. "Then sing, Daniel. Right here." Daniel's eyes widened in panic. I can't," he whispered, but Elvis squeezed his shoulder firmly, steady as a father might. "You can. Don't think about all them," he said, gesturing to the vast sea of faces. "Just think about your mama." He signaled to the orchestra with a small wave of his hand. The pianist, uncertain but obedient, laid down the faintest of chords, soft, almost a whisper of accompaniment. The violins followed with barely a hum. The microphone trembled in Daniel's hand. His first note wavered, thin and uncertain. For a second, he thought he would choke, his throat refusing to open. But then he saw, in his mind's eye, his mother's face in the balcony. The tired eyes, the way she sat nights at the kitchen table, shoulders bent with worry. And somehow, the sound pushed its way out. He sang. It wasn't polished. It wasn't powerful. His pitch slid at times, his voice cracked like dry timber. But it was true. Raw and unguarded, a child's voice carrying into the rafters with nothing but honesty behind it. Every imperfection made it more piercing. The words stumbled, but the longing inside them filled the hall more completely than any show tune could. The audience sat transfixed. A woman in the front row covered her mouth and began to sob openly. A man behind her, gray-haired and wealthy, wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed but unable to stop. Even the jaded gamblers who had only come to see Elvis as another Vegas attraction leaned forward, stunned into humility. When Daniel's final note fell into silence, he froze, waiting for ridicule. But the hall didn't laugh. Instead, the silence broke into applause so fierce it rattled the chandeliers. People rose to their feet once again, this time for him. Not because he was Elvis's guest, not because of spectacle, but because they had heard the sound of a boy singing for his mother's hope. Daniel's chest heaved, his face flushed crimson. He tried to hand the microphone back, ashamed of how weak his voice had sounded compared to the king's. But Elvis only pulled him close, his arm wrapped protectively around the boy. Into the microphone, Elvis declared, "Did you hear that? That right there is what music's about. Not perfect notes, not bright lights. Truth." The ovation swelled, echoing off the velvet walls and marble floors, until it became more than applause. It became a witness, a collective vow that none of them would forget what they had seen. Daniel stared out at the blur of faces, hardly able to comprehend it. For the first time since his father's accident, he felt something stronger than grief pressing inside his chest. It was hope, fragile, trembling, but alive. And as the scarf rested heavy on his shoulders and the crowd thundered in his ears, he realized he had just done the impossible. He had spoken his dream aloud and been heard. The ovation rolled on like waves, but Elvis didn't step back to reclaim the stage. Instead, he let it wash over Daniel, his arm still firm around the boy's shoulders. When the noise finally softened, Elvis lifted the microphone, his face solemn. "Son," he said gently, his voice carrying without force, "you just gave your mama the finest gift she'll ever get. You showed her you're brave enough to sing your heart, even when it shakes. That's more valuable than any house." The boy lowered his head, his tears dripping onto the scarf at his chest. He whispered, barely audible even with the microphone close, "But I want to buy her one. I want her to stop hurting." The audience shifted, their emotions caught between tenderness and devastation. Mothers in the crowd squeezed their children's hands. Men cleared their throats and avoided each other's eyes, shaken by the naked truth of a child's plea. Elvis turned toward the crowd, his expression hardening with resolve. "Folks," he said, "this young man reminded me of something I nearly forgot. When I was his age, all I dreamed of was giving my mama a place where she felt safe. That dream drove everything I ever did, and here he is, carrying that same fire inside him." He paused, his gaze scanning the glittering hall. Dreams like his deserve to be lifted up, not laughed at. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. It wasn't the usual roar of fans, but something deeper, communal. an understanding that they had been called to account for their own humanity. Then Elvis did something none of the organizers could have scripted. He placed the microphone in its stand and spoke without it, his voice still loud enough to carry. "I want to say this plain, with no show in it. This boy and his mama are going to be taken care of." The hall exploded in cheers. Women leapt to their feet, clapping until their rings rattled. Men cheered like they were at a prize fight, some slamming their palms against the stage. 1,000 flashes from cameras ignited at once, trying to capture the promise. Backstage, the casino officials nearly choked. This was philanthropy, live, unscripted, unapproved, broadcast in front of witnesses who would never let them bury it. Their schedules, their polished plans, their profit margins, all shattered by a single vow. But Elvis didn't look back at them. He leaned close to Daniel once more. "You hear me? We'll see to it that your mama doesn't cry at night anymore. Not because of where she lives, not because she's alone. You're not alone either." The boy shook his head as if unable to believe. "Why me?" he whispered. Elvis smiled faintly, though his eyes were wet. "Because you were brave enough to ask." The audience roared again, standing, applauding, whistling through tears. Some clapped with the force of people trying to drown out their own memories, of poverty, of loss, of children they'd failed to listen to. The hall no longer felt like Las Vegas. It felt like a small-town revival, a gathering of souls bearing witness to something holy. Elvis let the noise crest before he raised his hand. The crowd quieted instantly. "Friends," he said, "I don't know what you came here expecting tonight, but I hope you remember this boy's words longer than you remember mine." The boy looked up at him, stunned. No one had ever told him his words mattered before. Elvis pressed the scarf tighter against Daniel's shoulders, as though fastening it there. "This isn't just cloth," he said softly but firmly. "It's a reminder. Every time you feel like you can't be strong, you touch this scarf, and you remember tonight. You remember you've already done something most men never dare. You spoke your truth before the world." The audience was hushed again, leaning forward, desperate not to miss a syllable. A woman in the mezzanine whispered audibly, "Lord, I'll never forget this as long as I live." Daniel nodded, his lips trembling, the scarf heavy with new meaning. For the first time in months, his chest felt lighter, as though the grief he carried had found a place to rest outside of him. And as Elvis turned back to the orchestra, ready to close the night, the managers behind the curtain knew the truth. The concert would be remembered, not for the songs performed, but for a vow spoken by the king and sealed by the tears of a 12-year-old boy. The concert rolled on, but it no longer felt like the one printed on the glossy programs. Elvis sang a few more numbers, yet every verse was colored by what had already happened. The audience clapped and cheered, but the frenzy was gone. Instead, their applause carried warmth, as if each person in the hall was privately carrying Daniel and his mother in their thoughts. When the final curtain dropped and the spotlights dimmed, people didn't rush for the exits the way Vegas crowds usually did. They lingered, speaking in hushed tones, wiping at their eyes, aware they had witnessed something that would be whispered about long after the neon lights outside burned out. Daniel stood at the edge of the stage, scarf still heavy around his neck, notebook clutched to his chest. He looked smaller than ever, swallowed by the cavernous hall now emptying row by row. But something about his posture was different. Straighter, steadier. Elvis bent down once more, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Hold your head up, son," he murmured, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "The world will try to tell you you're small. Don't you ever believe it." Daniel nodded mutely. He wanted to answer, to thank him, but his throat had locked shut. Elvis smiled, ruffled his hair gently like a father might, and then he was gone, disappearing into the wings, leaving only the echo of his words behind. Up in the balcony, Daniel's mother rushed down the aisles, weaving past lingering guests and casino staff. When she reached him, she pulled him into her arms so tightly he thought his ribs might break. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her sobs shook against his ear, but they were different from the ones he had heard so many nights at the kitchen table. These tears were not from despair, but from release, from the unbearable weight of finally feeling seen. Security hovered nearby, unsure whether to usher them out quickly or give them space. But one of the guards, the same who had let Daniel slip closer to the stage earlier, gave a small nod and turned away, as if to say, "Let them have this." Outside, the desert night wrapped around them. Neon signs buzzed overhead, casting pink and blue glows across the pavement. Taxis pulled up, engines idling, their drivers impatient for fares. But Daniel and his mother didn't hurry. They walked slowly, side by side, the scarf bright against his plain shirt, the notebook tucked firmly under his arm. People on the sidewalk stared as they passed, some recognizing the boy from the stage, others simply struck by the sight of a child draped in one of Elvis Presley's scarves. A woman reached out as if to touch it, then pulled her hand back, embarrassed, sensing it wasn't hers to touch. Daniel glanced up at his mother. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but she was smiling. A real smile, the first he had seen since his father's accident. That alone felt like the miracle he had begged for in his notebook. They didn't speak much on the way back to their cheap motel room. Words seemed unnecessary. The night air carried the faint hum of traffic, the smell of gasoline and fried food from late-night diners, and above them, the desert sky stretched wide and clear. For once, Daniel didn't feel crushed by its vastness. He felt carried by it. When they reached the motel, the clerk behind the desk raised his brows in surprise. He had seen them leave earlier in their plain clothes, nervous and out of place. Now the boy walked in, wearing a scarf that glittered faintly, even under the dull fluorescent light. The clerk didn't ask questions, he simply nodded, as though acknowledging he'd seen something that needed no explanation. Inside their small room, Daniel laid the notebook and scarf carefully on the bedspread. The scarf shimmered under the weak lamp, its edges damp with sweat from the king himself. He touched it once, gently, then pulled his hand back, afraid he might damage it. His mother sat beside him, running her fingers over the worn notebook cover as if it were a relic. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was full, not empty. For the first time in months, Daniel drifted into sleep without clutching the notebook under his pillow. The next morning, newspapers across Las Vegas carried the story. Photographers had captured the moment Elvis bent low to embrace a poor boy from Arkansas, the scarf draped across narrow shoulders. Headlines spoke not of the set list or the glittering guests, but of the king's human moment. Yet the boy's name was absent. Reporters never printed it. In a way, that only deepened the legend, because in the years that followed, people told the story differently. Some said the boy was from Texas, others from Oklahoma. Some swore he sang flawlessly. Others remembered his voice cracking with every note. But all agreed on one thing, that for one night in Las Vegas, Elvis Presley had stopped being an untouchable star and had become something greater. A man who listened, who answered, who lifted a child out of grief and let the world see him. Daniel never cared about the versions told. For him, the truth was simple. He had carried a question in his heart, and Elvis had given him an answer. Strength wasn't about silence or stoicism. but about love. That truth stayed with him longer than the echo of applause. Years later, long after the neon faded and the scarf had been carefully folded away in a drawer, Daniel would still remember the weight of it on his shoulders as the greatest proof he had ever been given. That his words mattered, that his dreams mattered, and that his mother's tears were worth the courage it took to speak them. And that was the ending the world never forgot. Not a finale written in rhinestones and spotlights, but a boy and his mother walking beneath street lamps, clutching hope like a treasure no casino could ever buy.